I said, worked at Santee Cooper, been there since 2014. Started off in the energy efficiency department, and probably early 2016, my boss at the time asked me to look into electric vehicles a little bit, just do some very general research on it. There's a little bit going on, had some interest in it. Funny enough, I haven't seen Peter in years. I don't think I ever actually met him, but I called Peter King in 2016 because JEA was one of the only utilities doing something, and he gave me a fair amount of information back then. It probably helped kickstart a lot of stuff that we ended up moving into. By about 2019, this became, I'll say, a major part of my role at Santee Cooper. I wouldn't say it's my only job. Duke Dominion, those IOUs, they're pretty lucky that they can have folks who work specifically on e-mobility, or even a whole department that works specifically on e-mobility and electric vehicles. But as the co-ops, I'm sure are well aware, you sort of have to wear different hats at our companies. So I will say, to echo what Michael said there, I think it's important that somebody sort of has this as their top priority at the utility. I think everyone may have it as little pieces of their priority, but someone at the utility needs to probably have this as a top priority. There's lots of chatter all the time at work about different things EV, but hopefully this presentation will show you some of the specific planning things that we're doing to try to maybe combat some grid issues in the future here. So just quickly for the agenda, I'll do a quick intro about Santee Cooper, a little bit of our history, go into some of our internal initiatives, talk through some EV programs we have, and then I'll talk through some EV impact analysis where we'll have some actual data from some customers that we know on our grid, some AMI data from customers that we know of, and you can sort of see some of the impact that comes along with EVs. And I guess one other thing I'll mention before I start is I think I have an hour to talk here, so I don't want to just drone on at y'all for an hour straight. So please feel free to be interactive and ask questions throughout. So I'm not just talking for 45 minutes straight. So as far as who Santee Cooper is, we are electric and water utility, Moncks Corner, South Carolina, down near Charleston, probably about an hour outside Charleston, South Carolina. I think most of the co-ops from South Carolina are probably very familiar with us. We provide power generation to most of the co-ops in the state, at least. You can see in our composition here, wholesale makes up 68% of our customer composition as far as dollars coming in revenue. We have 22% from retail. We have about 200,000 retail customers. That's really what my group deals with, is our retail customers, about 165,000. Residential, around 35,000. Commercial, just hit the 200,000 customers a year, so we're very excited about that. You see our fuel mix down there. Future plans, we're moving a little bit away from coal, a little bit more to natural gas and renewables, which seems to be what a lot of folks are doing. It's probably pretty well in line with the industry standard. And then one thing we really pride ourselves on is our distribution reliability. We're in the top 2% this last year, and I think pretty much every year since I've been here in 2014, we've been, in one of those top percentiles up there in distribution reliability. So obviously there's concerns if EVs come on, start overloading transformers, things like that, that could affect our reliability. So we want to make sure that we continue to stay a top utility in that reliability. Just some other business that we have, we have the water systems, lake management. We do a lot of economic development, helps bring in over $15 billion investment, over 80,000 jobs since '88. We have some good environmental stewardship, and then we have energy management. So that's energy efficiency, demand response, electric vehicles, and solar programs. That's sort of what falls out in my department. And we just started doing some broadband support as well. So a quick history of the EVs at Santee Cooper. Well before my time, before I could even drive, Santee Cooper had 2 Chevrolet S10 pickup trucks. And I guess sort of the joke there was, if you took those S10 pickup trucks out in the field, you better have a bike in the back if you want to get back to the office. I think our fleet folks sort of retrofitted these vehicles, some electric motors in them, some batteries in them, and our fleet people are great, I'll say that, but they don't build vehicles for a living. They repair vehicles for a living. And so there's some issues there. So obviously 13 years went by. We decided we didn't want to do anything else with EVs. 2009, we got a line truck, which is hybrid, has some electric components in it. When the truck is actually stopped, it's not a plug-in hybrid. It's not getting electricity usage as you're driving. In 2011, We got 2 Toyota Prius sedans that, again, our fleet shop turned into hybrid electric vehicles. So they added some battery packs on there. They got, I think, around 10 miles of range, and then they would switch over to gas, and those are sort of driving billboards. They had stuff all on the outside of them. So those also didn't get a ton of use just because people didn't want to be riding in the driving billboard. 2013, we got an EV truck for meter reading. Same thing as 2009. It's not an actual electric truck, but it has some electric components. And then finally in 2020, we got 4 fully electric vehicles from OEM. So we have 1 Tesla Model 3, and we have 3 Chevrolet Bolts. And that's part of our bigger goal. By 2030, we want to get at least 60 light duty electric fleet vehicles. And obviously the purpose of that is 1, just to sort of understand how these vehicles work, how charging works, what the issues are. And then 2, is to really be a good steward of electric vehicles. We're encouraging folks to get in them. Obviously 2021 brought some issues with supply chain issues, so we weren't able to get any vehicles last year, but I think we have 1 more plug-in hybrid that we're looking at getting this year. To our initiatives. So in addition to the electric vehicles that we purchased, we also put in some electric vehicle charging infrastructure, both for those fleets and also for employees. So we have 3 different locations, office locations that have electric vehicle charging. This is our headquarters in Monk's Corner. What we've done is we're taking the 2 stations right here, and those are for fleet use, and the 2 stations out there are for employee use. We have a program in place that if an employee purchases an electric vehicle and they don't have a charging station at their location, then we will install one within 6 months, and we'll do up to 25 charging stations by 2030 for employees. Or if all the stations are being used up, essentially we will add on to the location they're at. The other 2 locations are the same. I think one of them has 2 fleet, 2 employee stations, and the other one has 1 fleet, 1 employee station. We also have a conference center where we have our board of directors meetings, IRP meetings, a bunch of other meetings, even public meetings sometimes out there for non-utility things. So we put 2 stations out there as well that folks are welcome to use. They're just unlocked for anyone to use at this time. I know a few folks have mentioned the signage and pavement markings. In South Carolina, we're lucky the State Energy Office has done a lot of work with electric vehicles, and we've been pretty involved with that. So they have put out some signage and pavement marking standards, which has been great. The signage, as you can see there, looks like legitimate highway signage that's a little bit more threatening than maybe some of the signs that you've seen. I think when we first started doing electric vehicles, there's a lot of signs that had leaves falling on them and stuff like that, because it was like a green thing, an environmental thing, and someone just pulls into there. They say a sign like that, they're like, oh, this is a suggestion. This isn't something we got to do. This is something they want us to do. With these signs, it's a little bit more like, there might be some consequences if you park in these spots that you're not supposed to. And also in South Carolina, they have a statewide marketing campaign called Plug In SC that's just to help get out the word about electric vehicle charging. So there's a stencil you can borrow from the State Energy Office. Paint the lines green. And so if anyone's from South Carolina, feel free to reach out. We can talk more about that. And I think the Energy Office will actually give you some free signage if you have some stations. I think up to two signs per location. One of the big things I want to talk about is our EV task force. And I guess this is hopefully something that sort of get you all thinking if you don't already have something similar to this. I guess my biggest takeaway from all this EV stuff would be it's really hard to work in a bubble when doing this EV stuff. If you work, I know there's a lot of engineers in here, mainly engineers. If you're working in distribution and you're only concerned with distribution, I think I heard the question earlier. What if our rates cause everyone to start charging at midnight, and that creates another peak and messes up a transformer? Well, if you're not talking with the rates department, then the rates department is going to design those rates however they see best fit for themselves. They may not be thinking about distribution. They might not fully understand how electric vehicles work, might not fully understand the demand, or they might not fully understand what's coming with electric vehicles. We have 32, 40, 48 amp chargers now, but as we start talking about folks putting in 60 amp and 80 amp chargers, they might be looking at data from today, not understanding that the data that's coming out tomorrow isn't going to be the same as the data today. And they're designing these rates that could be out of date, by next year, it's causing distribution centers serious issues. So I won't read through everyone here, but I will get into a few examples of sort of what this EV task force does. This is not all encompassing by any means of what we do, but just want to talk through a few of the things that we do as a task force. So we have some communication planning, obviously, different folks throughout the company and our customers. There's a ton of people that we need to communicate to. So obviously what we need to communicate with our leadership team is a lot different than what we need to communicate to our customers, to the employees. Even within the employees, there's subsets of employees. There's employees who we just need to teach them about electric vehicles so that as they're out in the field, they can knowledgeably talk to whoever customers, vendors, whoever they're talking to about electric vehicles. So that's something you should be doing for all of your employees, essentially. There's just a lot of misconceptions out there about electric vehicles, how they work. So, not everyone has to be an expert, but giving folks something to work with that they can talk about when they get these questions, because you don't know how it is if you work for the electric utility and your friend has a question about anything electric, whether or not it's in your field, they're going to ask you about it. So just giving them a little bit of information. Then we have the folks who are driving these vehicles. I think someone mentioned earlier, these are, a lot different than your normal vehicles sometimes. I don't know if any of y'all have driven a Tesla. The first time I drove it, I was working in EVs. I drove a Tesla, and thank goodness the guy who drives it at our company was there, and he owns a Tesla himself, because I couldn't find the charging port for it. It's hidden like behind a light. You would just if you didn't know it was there, you'd never think to, sort of pop that up. And so it's if you're driving this thing, you don't know how to plug it in. That's, obviously an issue. How you going to get to your job site if you don't know how to plug it in? If you don't understand the regenerative braking, when you take your foot off the gas pedal, that thing is the pedal, not the gas pedal, I should say. But it's just going to slow down immediately. It's not like a car where it sort of coasts for a while. It's going to lose power pretty quickly. So you got to inform those employees about something different. Encourage folks to want to get into EVs. Depending on how you budget for your fleet vehicles, you may have to talk to the folks who are budgeting for these vehicles and say, hey, look at the lifetime cost of these vehicles. You might have to budget an extra 10, 15, 20,000 if that's not a centralized budget with your fleet services. Say, we need to start thinking about this. We need to start budgeting appropriately so that we can get electric vehicles out there. Time of use rates. Again, I talked a little bit about that. We have a few time of use rates coming. We're working on some experimental rates, but having the EV rates, or the rates folks in with our engineers and the rest of these folks in this EV task force helps those people ask these questions to the rates department as they're developing them. They'll come back to us every month and say, here's sort of the update on rates. There can be some back and forth dialogue to help them improve how they're designing these rates. Put load forecast and EV forecast here. I think this was a pretty big one. I guess probably something you may or may not thinking about, but most utilities have a load forecast group that's trying to determine how much load are we going to be serving, 10, 20 years from now. So when we started talking to our load forecast group, those guys are about 10 times smarter than I am, but they were using EIA data, and that's pretty standard. That's what they do. They use EIA data. EIA is a reliable source of data. But when we got to looking at the electric vehicle information specifically, we were like, man, these look really low. Talked to some folks in the industry. The EIA, just the way that they project their data is based off historical adoption, essentially. It's just their methodology. And so it's very heavily historical. As we know, there hasn't been a ton of EVs historically. So it doesn't take into account the fact that, Ford and Volvo and all these GM, all these companies are investing tons of money. The federal government's investing tons of money into EVs. It's just saying, let's look back at the historical thing, project it out 20 years, and that goes in the load forecast. Well, now they're presenting that to, your management, essentially, and then your management goes, oh, well, there's no EVs coming. We don't need to be concerned. Look, they use those numbers. There's no EVs, no concern. So we work with them and say, hey, can we meet halfway? Here's some other forecasts. I think we heard a lot about Bloomberg New Energy Finance was one that I think has been mentioned multiple times today. Wood Mackenzie, there's a lot of more aggressive forecasts. So we ended up working with EPRI, and they sort of use a mix of different forecasts to come up with a sort of mid-tier forecast. So now our forecast department is looking at an EPRI case and EIA case. So we're putting both of those out there to say, it could potentially be low. It could be the EIA, but very, very reasonably, it could be this EPRI forecast as well. Obviously, distribution impacts, I'll get into that a little bit when we talk through some of the actual data. Just having folks understand the current EV market, and then improving our processes. So I guess one example of that is now in our new home packet, we just added a form whenever someone's developing a new neighborhood that says, are EVs going in this neighborhood? Yes or no, but we're interested in maybe putting it in some future developments, or no, we're just not interested in EVs. And if they say yes, or yes, maybe we're interested, then we can follow back up with those folks and talk to them about maybe some of their future projects or the current project if they're putting some make-ready infrastructure into these neighborhoods. We would try to do a lot of collaboration and benchmarking. So again, as far as regional electric vehicle groups, we talk to the Office of Regulatory Staff, the State Energy Office a fair amount. They've done a lot for the state of South Carolina. We're one of the founding members of SETRI, which is like the Southeastern Transportational Regional Initiative. We do a fair amount of utility benchmarking. So probably about quarterly or so, we meet with Duke, Dominion, Berkeley Electric. I know they've got some folks here today. We meet with some of their folks and we just say, what are y'all doing in the EV space? Talk through our programs, talk through things like this, learn from each other. We recently reached out to West Coast utilities. As you saw with the California numbers earlier, California is way ahead of us in this stuff. Is there anything we can learn from those folks? Maybe they're already doing some things to mitigate impacts. We talked to a lot of business and government organizations, so that's chambers, COGS, things of that nature, munis, and we're like, hey, what are y'all's plans for EVs? Do y'all want EVs for your city? Do you want EVs for your fleets? And you'd be surprised, none of these folks come to us, but whenever we get to talking to them and then we come and present at a meeting, all of a sudden, you hear all these plans that they had that they didn't share with you, and you're like, oh man, like seems like everyone's wanting to put in all these different infrastructure. EV manufacturing and auto companies, not every single meeting, but I would say a large majority of the meetings we have folks from different either manufacturers, auto companies, data collection companies come in and talk for half an hour. I think Robbie came in maybe December of last year and talked to our EV task force about some of the stuff Greenlawn's offered where it was at the time. And so we have people come in just so we know what's going on in the marketplace. And then EV charging station change out. This is just sort of a little project we did and maybe something you might be able to hopefully learn a little something from. But back in 2011, 2012 time period, we worked on a federal grant program to help install some charging stations. Essentially, all we did was we provided free electricity for these charging stations for 2 years. We didn't own or operate those stations, but we put some signage up with those stations at the time. So, around 2019, 2020, some of those stations started failing. The company that made those stations was no longer in the EV business. There's no way to fix them. And we kept getting calls because there was a sign right behind it that said Santee Cooper. And so we don't own those stations. We don't operate those stations, but that's, not the answer that they want to hear. Obviously, they just want to fix it. They're trying to charge their car. They want the infrastructure to be working. And so we had some extra electric vehicle charging stations. So we made the offer to those folks to say, hey, if you let us put in these new stations that are going to work a little bit more reliably, y'all guarantee to maintain them for at least 5 years and take down the signage with our name on it. We will give you these stations for free, essentially. So we were able to get 7 stations out there, and then we actually gave away, or in the process of giving away 3 more stations to folks who weren't originally part of that process. I'll stop real quick. Is there any questions before I get into the programs?
One of the other slides talked about distribution impact. When you have a developer coming to you and they want to make ready a neighborhood for EV chargers, do they pay for that?
So I would say as of now, yes. We haven't had many come to us and say they're going to put in EVs, but that's something that this task force, like the perfect example of something this task force is working on to say, what do we need to do? Is there some kind of, like our current line extension policy isn't written exactly that way, but we know some other utilities are looking into doing something similar to like a line extension type policy to say is, if you put these in and we see a certain amount of EV usage over a few years, then we will cover the cost of those. So not guaranteeing that we're doing that, but we're looking into those type of things to see if there's, some good middle ground there where maybe we can provide some funds if we're going to see a return on those funds.
We've had some conversations where there's growth and they're talking about impact.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and get to, sorry.
So you offered a $500 rebate for the charger. What your expectations and how much was allocated and what is the take rate right now?
Gotcha. I'll get into that with some of the programs. I think I have some slides on that specifically. And if I don't answer your question, please let me know and I will definitely follow up on that. A lot of the data that goes into this EV impact analysis is specifically from customers that have used that rebate program. And that's really a big goal of it, is that we don't know where our EV customers are necessarily. We can get DMV data that will give us information down to the zip code, but historically they haven't given us address level information about those customers. So we know, there's about 1,000 EV customers out there, but we don't know where they are. And so that was part of the goal of that program, was to identify those customers, look at some of their charging histories and determine what impact that's going to have on the grid. All right, so I'll start with our Evolve grant program. Our team came up with a great Evolve name. It just launched less than a week ago, I think last Wednesday, this program launched. And what it is a grant program sponsored by Santee Cooper, where customers can apply for up to $25,000 of funding from Santee Cooper. You see, we're almost matching the federal funding of a few billion with our $100,000 here. But really the reason we decided to go with the grant program is we have tons of customers coming to us, whether it's, large businesses, small businesses, HOAs, multifamilies, transit agencies, and everyone just wants to know, what can you do for us? And some people want to buy fleets, some are wanting to put in charging infrastructure, some are just wanting to do education outreach type things. We're like, look, we have a somewhat limited budget that we can work with here. So if we're just giving people $250, $100, it's not going to go very far for a commercial project. These commercial projects get pretty expensive pretty quickly depending on the project. So we were like, how about we just reach out to folks and say, hey, here's a pool of money. Come to us with your projects that you want to do, and we will fund the best projects. And we'll do that each year from now until 2026. Essentially, we'll have $100,000 per year. We just have to go back to the board every year as long as the program's progressing, then we'll get that $100,000 each year to allocate in funds. And those funds will be paid out upon completion of the project. So we hopefully won't have any stranded funds out there where we're giving them 50 or $25,000 and then they never complete a project. Benefits that we're hoping for from that, obviously we want additional EV infrastructure. It's huge into helping with the second thing there with the reduction of range anxiety and just to help our customers' needs. There's a lot of folks who want EV infrastructure in their businesses. Obviously it encourages third-party investments. We're not going to pay for all of your electric vehicle infrastructure, all of your fleet vehicle. We're going to pay for the infrastructure. We'll pay half of it. For the fleet vehicle, we'll pay up to 25% to help you with some of those incremental costs. But you got to have some skin in the game. We want these folks to have skin in the game and to be advocates of electric vehicles when they're putting these projects into place. It helps prepare us to be a future EV destination. We serve the Grand Strand area of South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, a lot of those beaches there. So we have tons and tons of tourists. It's amazing how many of our homes are rental homes in our service territory. And so we want folks to be able to get to Myrtle Beach, do their traveling, do their tourism, and then comfortably get home as well, not be searching for a charger, not have fear that they're not going to be able to make it back home if they come stay with us. Obviously, we want to increase the adoption of EVs, support state and federal EV initiatives, and then, I think all the first six things there really fall into the last thing here, which is, it's a great revenue stream for Santee Cooper. Not only a great revenue stream, but really the first time that a lot of folks have a battery in their home, or really a lot of, for the utility, the first time we really had batteries for most of us. That's what's crazy to me, and something I always tell folks at work is, you know, we have a lot of folks, that, even at work, you know, you drive to the parking lot and you see these huge vehicles that folks are very passionate about, even at our workplace. And, you know, big diesel truck or something like that. And we're not trying to convince those folks to get into electric vehicles. We're trying to convince the people that are on the fence. But a lot of times you have to tell them, you know, they have this negative connotation with electric vehicles for whatever reason. And that's not a problem. But if you have that connotation, I would think about it as not a customer coming to you saying they have an electric vehicle, but a customer coming to you and saying, hey, I purchased a battery. I'd like to put it on your electric grid. And then how do we do something with that battery? So that might be sort of another way to look at it if you're not a big EV person. So as far as the grant program, we have 4 major project categories that we're going to take projects in. I won't read them off there because I have them on the next slide as well. So we have make ready research. Essentially, you know, if a government or a muni or something like that comes to us and says, hey, we want to do a research project, see where the best places to put in electric vehicle charging in our city is. That could be a qualifying project, you know, maybe work with some of these entities that are here today, some of the things that they do. We have education outreach. So if a university does a ride and drive type event, or just wants to put it on an event to let folks know about electric vehicles and really increase the community's understanding of EVs, that could possibly qualify. And then probably where we'll get the most projects is EV charging infrastructure and fleet conversion. And those are pretty self-explanatory, you know, putting electric vehicle charging infrastructure to charge these vehicles and then actually getting the fleets. As far as the scoring, we have 5 scoring criteria for these. They're not weighted completely equal. The project feasibility and utilization is the most heavily weighted. I think at the end of the day, we need something that's going to go out in the field that's going to be used. If it's not used, it's not really helpful to us. So that's weighted pretty heavily. Use of funds, that's, you know, do they have matching funds and where are those matching funds coming from? Innovation, if we get 20 of the exact same projects, that's probably not going to be very innovative to us. We'd like to see something, you know, maybe that we haven't thought of, or something where they're going to share a lot of data with Santee Cooper. Equity, so serving underserved communities. So that could be low income. For us, that could be multifamily. You know, we have a lot of folks who are interested in multifamily and putting charging in, but it's as you probably heard a lot today, it's kind of a complex process compared to residential or just commercial. So those projects might get some points in the equity piece and then additional benefits.
Did you see any creative submissions around equity?
So we have not received any yet. We just launched the program last week.
What is that?
Yeah, that's okay.
In general, have you seen anything across network?
Yeah, I've seen some different takes on it, I guess, from different folks. So I guess there's the take that, you know, like transit buses, for example, that can sort of be seen as like an equity piece because a lot of times low income folks may not have a vehicle of their own. And obviously most of those folks can't afford a $50,000 vehicle. So I think there's a case to be made there. You know, if we can get electric buses, you know, there's better air quality, things like that for lower income communities. I've seen some stuff about like e-bikes or e-scooters or things like that in some of those communities. This specific program doesn't qualify like e-bikes and things like that, but I have seen some stuff like that in the past. And then generally just getting charging into those areas. But that's the tough part, because obviously the utilization piece is important as well. If you just put charging in a community that has no AVs, then it's not good for them. It's not good for us. So definitely something that's still being worked on. The used car market is slowly starting with EVs, but you just don't have that many. I mean, they're still pretty new.
Range is not really that great on a lot of these used ones.
Yeah, exactly.
What about pole mount? There's like, pole mount has a lot of nuance to it too. Who owns the light? Who owns the pole? Who owns the sidewalk? You know, like where I am, I live in a town that's in a county, and there's a lot of nuance. I don't know if you've heard anything about that.
As far as who's owning
So for
Yes,
pole mounted, for public parking, so a lot of these, the communities, the underserved communities wouldn't have a dedicated parking space. They're using street parking.
Yeah.
It's pretty popular in Europe right now.
Europe.
They have technology mounted in the pole, but they're used to carrying cords in their car. So we put the cords on our assets in the field. So I don't know if you heard anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, for us, that would probably fall into like the innovation
Okay.
side of things. That would be a little bit more innovative process, I guess, than most products around. So they would probably get some quality points for something like that in the innovation.
I think over in New York, there's some applications around that as well. Yeah, in bias.
Questions? All right, we also have the residential rebate program, which I talked a little bit about earlier. Essentially, customers get up to $500 rebate when they purchase a level 2 smart charger. We pre-qualify those chargers based on some criteria and review that every year, add some additional chargers to it. The customer does agree to give us 5 years of charging data when they sign up for this program. So we have not yet taken advantage of that. You typically need an aggregator to collect data from these stations. So we have not actually collected data specifically from those charging stations. But we are looking at their AMI data and trying to discern some information from that. And we have, I think, 92 or 93 chargers that we've rebated so far since last year. All right. I'll go into the impact analysis now. Some actual data. So this is the data that we got from EPRI about their projection for our service territory of where they think electric vehicles are going to be. So, right now we're sitting right around 1,000 vehicles, which matches up somewhat well with the last DMV data that we got. So we feel pretty confident about that. By 2029, we're looking at about tenfold of where we are over the next 7 years. So that's not insignificant. And then by 2041, we're looking at 48,000 vehicles. Remember, we have about 165,000 customers. So you're talking over 25% of our customers at that point would have electric vehicles. And I think the blue here is the how many vehicles were already in service, and then orange is obviously new electric vehicles. And then of these vehicles, 77% are projected to be fully battery electric, and the other 23% would be hybrid, plug-in hybrids. Yes.
165,000 customers or accounts?
Accounts. Or residential accounts.
Do you remember the number of vehicles in your service territory?
Total vehicles in our service territory, not off the top of my head that we have that information somewhere. So, and okay, they're using percent of new vehicle sales that are electric. It's 27% of the EV market share by 2041. All right, so this graph sort of shows a tool that the Department of Energy has put together. It's called a EV Pro Lite. Essentially, you can put some data in there. It will give you a load map showing you what load is going to look like in your service territory. Essentially, if you don't do anything to impact electric vehicle consumption. So if you just let people go out, do whatever they're going to do, this is what the load is going to look like. So they put in the information for our utility, our load forecast department did. These megawatts that you see on the side is how much megawatts expected to be added to the peak if there's no utility intervention per 10,000 electric vehicles. So if we have 50,000 electric vehicles by 2041, right around there, this is going to be 5 times these numbers. So you can see that could cause some significant impact if we have that many vehicles and we do nothing to change the load there. You're looking at maybe around 18 that's coinciding pretty perfectly with our summer peak. Luckily, currently we're a winter peaking utility. There's not a ton of load on the winter peak. So honestly, the generation side isn't as much of a concern for us right now as maybe the distribution side would be. Again, going into what does charging look like now versus what does future charging look like. So if I recall correctly, this data is based off sort of current charging, but we have a lot of 32, 40, and 40 amp 48 amp stations in our service territory. You know, Hummer, Ford F-150, a lot of these folks are talking about at least offering an 80 amp station. So I think the F-150 is not required, but it will be an offer that's out there. So as you're talking about going from 9 kW to 19.2 kW, that's pretty significant increase there. Today, of all the customers we know about, we don't have any transformers with more than one EV, but obviously when you get 48,000 EVs, it's going to be pretty hard to not have multiple customers on a transformer. So we ran a report of our residential rebated stations. So since we know which stations these customers have, we ran a report to see what's the realistic max amperage of those stations. And I say realistic because I think we rebated a few Gen 1 and Gen 2 Tesla stations, and those used to charge at 80 amps, but Tesla did an update on those vehicles to limit them to 48 amps. So the nuance in that, I guess, but realistically, they're not going to charge it more than 48 amps. So you can see, of the stations that we offer, most folks are going for the option that has the most charging power. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that when come out with 80 amp stations. I think people, again, a lot of these folks are just interested in the EV. They don't understand the power side of it really. And they're just thinking, oh, the faster I can charge up, the better it is for me. Someone else talked about the cluster effect as well. So these are like 8 different customers that we have in one neighborhood in our service territory. And they see their friends or their enemies or whoever keeping up with the Joneses. They have EVs, they want to keep up with them, or they drove it and they thought it was fun. And so you'll probably see more of this. And just, certain areas are more prone to having EVs, folks that are affluent areas, typically have more EVs there. So last year we analyzed 5 initial EV customers, sort of selected at random from the customers that we have. And those customers, I say random, really, we're picking customers that we had a fair amount of AMI data for. We just finished last year putting in doing a full AMI meters for all of our customers. And so we picked 5 that had at least a fair amount of AMI data going back. And we looked at a 2-month period from July to August. And we're going to continue this analysis with additional EV customers. So I think long term, we'll ideally do all of our customers, all 92 of the customers that we have, and continue to do that as we grow our AMI and MDM system. So I wanted to start with analysis of a 25 kVA transformer. Like I said, the generation side, from what we're seeing, is probably not an immediate concern. Long-term concerns, maybe, probably not immediate. The transformer side, it's hard to say, especially on the smaller size transformers. So this transformer specifically has one EV driver. I don't know if y'all can see that down there, but this first bar right here was the EV customer. And this graph is showing their non-coincident peak on the transformer. So all of these folks were not on at the same time here, but this was their peak for that 2-month study period. So you can see this EV had a 15.5 kW peak compared to 9.2 for the next highest EV customer. And I promise we didn't just pick this one because it had a higher. Every customer that we looked at on the EV system was similar to this, where the EV customer is pretty much the highest, I think, except in one case where there may have been 1 or 2 folks who were higher than that specific EV customer. But the coincident peak was 24.7 kW, so you're getting pretty close to capacity there. Non-coincident peak, which is what this would all add up to be, would be 38.5 kW. So I pulled, when did they hit the peak? What half-hour period did they actually hit the peak? And that would have been this half-hour period. So you can see the EV contributed to over half of that coincident peak of that transformer. They were running at 13.4 kW, and you have 3 right around 4 and right around 4. So these non-EV customers weren't significantly high at that point. Obviously, they got up to 8, 5, and 9, so they weren't anywhere close to their max demand during the demand on the transformer, essentially. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at that and say, what if this customer?
Are any services having to be placed?
Currently, no, but that's what we're trying to monitor. So we have a distribution impact subgroup of our EV task force. I hope I don't butcher this. I'm not an engineer. The rest of the guys on this team are engineers, so they can probably get better information, but essentially they're looking and saying, do we need to do anything currently to prepare for these EVs, even if it's not upsizing the transformer now? You know, all the wiring that was in the house, do we need to have that prepared to be upsized, or as we build additional infrastructure, essentially on new builds, do we need to be doing anything? We haven't finalized that yet. I think we're trying to finalize that by August to make that presentation to our management to say, yes, we need to be doing something, or no, let's hold off for a few years until we have more electric vehicles. So really right now we're just in a monitoring scenario, but I think, you know, if we were to see something serious here, you know, I think if we were to see this be 35 or something like that, I think we, you know, we might take a deeper look at it and say, you know, how often is this happening? Is this happening? Was this one time and then it never happened again on this transformer? Is this something that's happening 3 times a week? And if it's happening 3 times a week, you know, then maybe those guys go out and say, do we need to change that transformer out with a 50 kVA or something to combat the issues there? So that's really why we want to try to get the analysis done on more of these customers and really prioritize, sort of as I talk through it, hopefully see why we're prioritizing the smaller transformers, just because there's less diversity there than there would be with a lot of folks on a 75 or 100 kVA transformer.
So just like an anomaly that you walk around the house and you do things. Anyways, my father's residence, he installed a type 2 charger in the house. So he's got this brand new electric vehicle, and he went out and he also, he's got his riding lawnmower, fully electric, Ego. He's really proud of that. And we had 1,000 square foot to the top of the house, right? So really proud of that. So everybody in the room is probably thinking, oh my God, the electric service must be, off the charts. And we changed the air conditioning from a SEER rating of 13 to a SEER rating of 22. And he's utilizing less energy today than he ever was before the installation of the type 2. So I don't know, you look at studies and I think, maybe what Bill was saying, everything's kind of individualized at one point. Yeah,
it is. And that's a great point, because I bet if you look at that home, the demand is probably looking similar to this. But then if you just look at energy, if you don't have AMI data right now and you're just looking at energy, you might say like, oh, everything's good. Like no one's using a lot of energy, no problems. But obviously, this gets upwards of 20 or something on a 25 kVA transformer, maybe you do actually have some problems, even though the energy usage isn't extremely high there.
Y'all weren't thinking about curtailing the load, only about upgrading the service?
No, curtailment, time of use, those things are definitely potential, but more so just trying to make the case, to our management, to our distribution folks to say, why should we even be concerned with this? And then the next goal is, how do we combat this appropriately? So I think those are two different issues there, but definitely, I think our approach now is to work on some of those time of use rates, get some of these folks to not be charging. If they can charge in the middle of the night, we're hoping that these other folks probably have fairly low demands there, probably not even 3 or 4. And we can maybe fix some of those problems that way. But long term, that might not be the solution. As someone said earlier, if we have time of use rates and everyone starts getting EVs, then that creates its own set of problems. So that's why you got to have someone who's thinking about this constantly and continuing to update it, because you can sort of put some measures in place now that are going to help us get through, the next few years. But then when you get to the next few years, it may be another solution that we have to work on at that point. So what I did here was I took that same, so we knew this customer had a 40 amp charger since they used our rebate program, looked at it, and that's what they had. So this EV was charging it at 9.2 kW at this point. And so we said, well, what if this customer either A, bought another 40 amp charger because their wife decided that they wanted an EV2 and they both had gone to something, come home at the same time, plug in, or they decided, what, this new 80 amp charger came out. I really need this thing so I can get my car charged up even faster. So what does an additional 9.2 kW look like on that? So if you add that on, now this customer has a 22.6 kW demand on that 25 kVA transformer. Like that single vehicle is essentially about to fill the capacity of that transformer, which is fairly significant. You still have these folks, and again, this is probably not even a bad time for them. If that coincides with the bad time, this could start pushing 35, 40 on kVA transformer. I won't say much more about it because I'm not an engineer, but I think y'all probably understand the effects that that would have if that's happening with any type of regularity. I broke it down by into a week so that y'all can sort of see what some of these spikes look like. Obviously, this blue customer is the one that has the EV. You can pretty much see exactly when they're charging their EV. It's not really questionable what else is going on there. It goes from not using electricity to all of a sudden they're using 14 kW. You know, they're down here around 4. All of a sudden they're up at 13, 14 up here. So it's pretty, sometimes it's pretty obvious when folks are doing it. Those peaks are like nothing else you see on here. This peak right here in the middle, I broke that down just the individual day so you can sort of see what that looks like. This customer plugged in at half hour 32, 33 or so. So that must be, can't do my math that quick, but probably around 5 o'clock, I would say 4 or 5 o'clock. They were charging for a few hours there at pretty high demand. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't steady demand. They probably had some other stuff coming in on and off in their house, but it stayed at a pretty high demand there for 3-4 hours. And then just to sort of prove that this customer isn't like that every day, this is them on a non-charging day. You can actually see their demand is actually fairly low compared to some of their neighbors there. So they don't have high demand aside from that EV charging station.
Bought that high sear air conditioner.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you have a lot of solar and energy efficient folks also purchasing electric vehicles. Same thing here. I won't go into quite as much detail on this one, but essentially you have a 14.8 kW customer in the EV. This is a 50 kVA transformer with a 40 amp charger. Again, the rest of these folks are non-EV customers. Obviously, all of them have lower demand. This customer is getting close, but still, you know, 3 kW less than the EV customer. So the non-coincident peak on this transformer is 76 kW. Luckily, the coincidental peak over that 2-month period was only 40.6 kW. So for this example, if you were to put on additional 9.2 kW because they upsized or another customer got a 40 amp station and started charging at the same time, you still wouldn't hit your capacity. And I think you'll see that a lot with 50 kVA transformers. You're bumping up against that capacity compared to 25, where it's like just overshooting it pretty quick. And then 75 and 100, the concern is probably even less. So took all of our customers and we said, well, what size transformers do all these customers have? So we ran a report of all of our customers that use our rebate program and said, okay, we have about 11% that are on 25 kVA transformers. Those are probably the ones we should look at first. So that'll probably be our next step, is to look at all those customers, understand their usage, make sure they're not currently overloading those transformers too much, move on to the 50Ks, and then eventually get to the 75 and 100 kVAs. So just, what are we doing to deal with demand? Obviously, we continue to monitor our known EV customers. There's only 90 of them. We have 900 others that we don't know about. So that's where we're trying to get better data there on those customers, figure out how we can figure out where they are.
Just curious, is 25 kVA your minimum transformer size?
I think it is. We may have some smaller, but if it is, it's pretty rare, is my understanding. And then obviously we're benchmarking utilities that have higher EV adoption. So one example I do want to give is we talked recently within the past few weeks to a utility out in California that has a pretty similar customer base to us. And they have yet to see really any transformer issues. I only bring that up to say they have about 4% EV adoption. We currently have about 0.4% EV adoption. And if you look at our forecast, we don't expect to get 4% EV adoption until probably 2027, 2028. So we're still 5 years behind California, and they're not really running into issues that much yet. So not to say like we shouldn't do anything, but also like you don't have to run back to your management and be like, EVs are going to destroy the grid tomorrow, or anything like that. But they did say under a high adoption scenario, which they think is somewhat realistic. Their internal analysis showed a high likelihood of issues over the next 10 years. And I think they said, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, it was about 15,000 of their 50,000 transformers they expected to be overloaded by 2030 if they hit this high adoption scenario. So even if they don't hit the high adoption scenario, even if you're talking 3,000, 5,000 transformers, 10% of your transformers for them by 2030, that's still pretty significant. So they're going to have to do something to combat that. And so, we'll continue to keep up with those utilities. And luckily we, since they're ahead of the curve, they can make a lot of mistakes and we can learn from them, which is nice. But, also to be said, someone at your utility has to be keeping up with those folks or else you're not going to have that information. And then obviously, we'll make upgrades or programs or whatever we need to do as issues arise and monitor for when we need to be a little bit more proactive. That's all I got. I don't know. Got 5 minutes here. If anyone